Hello, you're tuned into Eye on Africa here on France 24. I'm Rochelle Ferguson-Biya. These are the top stories on the continent. Cameroon's President Biya orders an end to legal proceedings against three so-called Anglophone leaders who were arrested last December over turmoil in the country's northwest and southwest regions. We cross live to get the very latest from our correspondent. Nigeria's President Muhammadu Buhari led his first cabinet meeting for 5 months following a lengthy stay in London for medical treatment, but there's growing speculation over his health. And almost 2 million Muslims descend upon Mecca this year for the traditional Hajj pilgrimage. 500,000 have made the trip from the African continent. For many, it's the journey of a lifetime. We begin in Cameroon, where President Biya has ordered an end to all legal proceedings against three so-called Anglophone leaders arrested over ongoing turmoil in the country's northwest and southwest regions. Ayapol Abin, Felix Agbor Congo and Fontem Agbor Teka Neba were facing trial at Yaoundé's military court alongside 100 other English-speaking Cameroonians. Well, according to a government statement, the move's an attempt at seeking peaceful solutions in the two regions. There have been months of protests by Cameroon's Anglophone population who say they're discriminated against by the Francophone majority. Well, to bring us the very latest, our correspondent Zigoto Chaya is in Yaoundé. We can cross live to him. Zigoto, good to have you. What's the latest we have on the legal proceedings being stopped?
Oh yes, the unexpected news about the release of Agbon Congo, Fontem Neba, Ayapol Abine, and some others came on the eve of the trial of the English-speaking leaders to be held this Thursday at the military tribunal in Yaoundé. This announcement is a great relief for their families after 8 months of anguish. The reason why some people consider it as mixed messages or mixed message is because to them, the end of the president's announcement is like some form of a threat, because they say he still uses strong words to condemn those who will attempt any civil disobedience in the country. The question now is whether this act is a means to reactivate the resumption of schools that was paralyzed in the English-speaking parts of Cameroon. Some of the leaders are still on strike. The atmosphere remains uncertain as per whether this release would have an impact on the Anglophone crisis.
Now, Zigoto, you touched on a possibility of mixed messages there. Today's news comes on the same day the country banned people from watching a very popular TV station which says it defends the interests of the English-speaking population.
Actually, supporters of the Southern Cameroon's Ambazonia, as they call it, created this television channel to defend their cause and inform the world of events happening in the former British Cameroons, something the Cameroonian government do not want to digest. The Minister of Communication had formally informed them to stop broadcasting the programs of the Southern Cameroon's Broadcasting Corporation television channel, calling it a propaganda organ for those who want to break the country in two halves. He further considers them as violators and warns that their equipment will be seized if the dare continues. Yet, they are still operational. The TV channel is operational in some parts of the northwest and the southwest regions of Cameroon. But somehow it should be pointed out that despite the announcement of the release of the Anglophone leaders, all attempts by the government to put an end to this crisis are pending, and the Anglophone crisis remains an issue on the flesh of the Cameroonian government.
Zigoto Chaya reporting for us from Yaoundé. Thank you. To Nigeria next, where President Muhammadu Buhari led his first cabinet meeting for 5 months this Wednesday, following a lengthy stay in London for medical treatment. 74-year-old Buhari returned to Nigeria on August the 19th after more than 100 days in the British capital. It was his second round of treatment in the UK so far this year for an unspecified condition. The president skipped last week's ministerial meeting, leading once again to speculation over his health. Well, a short time ago, I spoke to our Nigeria correspondent, Rosie Collier. I asked her how Nigerians are reacting to see President Buhari back at work.
In the end, I think people know that health is human happiness, and people are just happy to see him well again. And I think that ultimately he'll be given a grace period of a month or so because people will just be happy to see him back. But then we did see, there is impatience, particularly among some members of the opposition. There were protests while he was away, resign or resume. And so he has now resumed. But I think that it will take probably just a few weeks, Nigerians are notoriously impatient for them to start asking questions about, his campaign promises. He's been in power now for 2 years. He promised to improve the security situation. That has not improved in the northeast a great deal. He also promised to create over 1 million jobs. They've certainly not been created. And then also just to improve the economy, and Nigeria has just about gotten itself out of recession, but it's still hard times for the vast majority of the 180 or so million people who live there.
I mean, Buhari is back, and this was a second stay in the UK. His condition, as it were, is still unspecified. It's still been undisclosed. There's a real kind of contrast. Some people saying, well, look, health is private. He doesn't have to discuss it with people. Others saying, once you're in the public eye, it's in the public's interest for you to tell them what's going on.
Yes, that's true. The feeling is, I think, for most Nigerians, that is his private business. And I'll tell you why. Because health is still shrouded in sort of traditional mystery in Nigeria, in as much as people don't look at health issues necessarily as something scientific, but rather sort of tied to your destiny and maybe sort of evil spirits, those sorts of things. And so bearing in mind that Buhari's his support base are largely, the kind of the poor, basically, the northern poor, who do still buy into these traditional belief systems. And so for Buhari to sort of disclose that, what kind of his illness he has, that may be, misinterpreted. But also we have to bear in mind just 2 years away from the next general election, or presidential election, and campaigning will start late next year. And if, Buhari was to come out and say actually what was wrong with him, then there would be many question marks over whether he is whether he's physically able to campaign for the next presidential election, and whether if he was to win, whether he'd be able to rule for another 4 years.
Each year on the 30th of August, the world marks International Day for Victims of Enforced Disappearances. In Burundi, human rights organisations have reported thousands of missing persons since 2015, when violence erupted over Pierre Nkurunziza being sworn in as president for a controversial third term in office. Well, political opponents and protesters in and around the capital, Bujumbura, were heavily targeted. Many were later found dead in rivers, sometimes decapitated. Well, journalist Jean Biya was reported missing last July. To date, there have been no leads on his disappearance. His colleagues say they're deeply saddened. Have a listen.
I often dream of Jean. It's terrible. I dream that we're talking. We often teased each other, gave each other stories to cover, told each other what angle to take on a story, things like that, things colleagues do. I say they're dreams, but this is all like one long nightmare. It's a nightmare, and when I wake up it hurts. There's no real hope. He isn't the only one to have disappeared.
And finally, close to 2 million Muslims are in Mecca this year for the traditional Hajj pilgrimage, which is the 5th pillar of Islam. 500,000 have made the trip from Africa, with Egypt, Nigeria and Algeria being among the top contributors of pilgrims. For many, it's the journey of a lifetime, but also one that carries major health and safety risks. France 24's Clément Bonnereau has this report.
To the right, high-rise buildings and restaurants. To the left, the Great Mosque of Mecca, dazzling in the sun. With his arm outstretched, Abdul Rahman films everything on his smartphone, so his son in Tanzania can experience the pilgrimage to Islam's holiest site, the Haramain.
I'm talking with my son. He is in Tanzania. When I enter in Haramain, I'm showing him the live picture of Haramain, that we reach in Haramain and how happy we are, how lucky we are.
Abdul Rahman is one of 1.6 million pilgrims expected in Saudi Arabia for this year's Hajj celebrations. Around 500,000 come from Africa, including 108,000 Egyptians, 79,000 Nigerians, 36,000 Algerians and 31,000 Moroccans. Saudi Arabia operates a quota system for Muslim-majority nations. Some families have to apply for years before they finally get a visa.
I've been waiting for this for 4 years. I kept applying for it, and luckily God made it possible for me to go to Mecca this year.
Health and safety are top concerns for Riyadh. Last year, pilgrims from Liberia, Sierra Leone and Guinea were able to travel to Saudi Arabia for the first time since the 2014 Ebola outbreak. This year, authorities have imposed strict guidelines regarding vaccinations, especially for contagious diseases such as meningitis. Vaccination against polio is also compulsory for citizens of 20 countries, 14 of which are in Africa.
Your Eye on Africa team is back tomorrow at the same time. Up next, more international headlines.
Reporters, presented by Mark Owen.
Just a few years ago, the self-declared Republic of Somaliland was a peaceful oasis in a war-torn country. It once prospered from the camel trade, but now faces a humanitarian crisis. With scarcely a drop of rain over the past 4 years, business and livestock are waning. Throughout the Horn of Africa, 17 million people are at risk of starvation. But in the midst of this medical desert, there are some who are fighting to slow the approaching catastrophe.
Reporters on France 24 and France24.com.